Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome and I'm here to break down UFC Vegas 65, which is headlined by a heavyweight fight between Derrick Lewis and Sergey Spivac. But just before I get into the breakdowns, I just want to take a moment just to pay my respects to the news that was circulated and, the news that hit the MMA world like a wave last night with the loss and the passing of Anthony Rumble Johnson. Anthony Rumble Johnson, obviously one of the most devastating knockout artists, a feared man inside the cage, a fighter that had instant respect from anybody standing across from him just because of that raw power that he possessed. But although I didn't know the guy personally, from what I've heard of people that did, he was a real good guy as well. So, the loss is the loss of the MMA world, and my thoughts and prayers go out to Anthony Rumble Johnson's family, his friends and his loved ones. Rest in peace, Rumble. Now, just very quickly, just before we do get into the breakdowns, as always, there's going to be a Base AI recap from our UFC prediction software from last weekend at UFC 281. Another good event. Base AI across the straight pick predictions hit 71%. That's 10 fights predicted correctly out of the 14 fights in total. There are also some good method of victories predicted as well, and some method of victories plus rounds also. So make sure you check out that recap if you are interested in the AI and the algorithms at MMA Play 365. But now straight into the breakdown, straight into the predictions. In the heavyweight division, the main event, we've got Derrick Lewis versus Sergey Spivac. I'm not confident that we're going to need 5 rounds for this. It almost always feels like a waste of 5 rounds when we get a Derrick Lewis main event. And that's not just because of Derrick Lewis's insane knockout power, but he's also finishable as well, if that makes sense. But I think it's going to be one of those fights where, obviously, Derrick Lewis's path to victory is the knockout here. Absolutely. It's pretty much always his path to victory. It's very unlikely that Derrick Lewis is going to go 5 rounds to a decision and win a decision, because ultimately, if he's going to have that much success in regards to landing volume and landing strikes, then he's more than likely going to find that knockout within that 25 minutes than end up going to a decision. But on the other side of the cage to Derrick Lewis, we have got Sergey Spivac, who has quietly been making waves in the UFC and has been slowly rising up the rankings in the heavyweight division, and he's got himself a well-deserved main event spot. And I actually think it's a really good fight for Sergey Spivac, as long as obviously he doesn't get knocked out. But listen, everybody that fights Derrick Lewis, we're always going to have that same conversation. Is Derrick Lewis going to land something on that fighter? And, he might land something on Spivac and he might knock him out. But outside of that, I think Spivac is a very educated fighter. I think he's a smart fighter. I think he's a fighter that has developed and improved leaps and bounds from when he first came into the UFC. And honestly, when he came into the UFC, I thought he was going to be one of those fighters that is going to be around for maybe 3 or 4 fights, suffer 2 or 3 knockouts maybe out of those 3 or 4 fights and ultimately get cut. But he's a fighter that has improved. He trains under Eric Nixick at Extreme Couture. His wrestling is very good, and ultimately I think that this is where he beats Derrick Lewis, and this is where it is a good fight for Spivac, because Spivac is under no illusion of what he's good at. He knows he's good. He's a good wrestler. He knows he's a good grappler, and he's the type of fighter that just won't even engage with Derrick Lewis and allow Derrick Lewis too many opportunities to land something hard on him. I think Spivac's going to come out here. I think he's going to start on the outside. I think he's going to shoot early, get Derrick Lewis against the cage, take him down and just grind on him, work on him. And whether he gets that finish in the first round, I'm not sure. But what the wrestling and topside grappling of Spivac will do to Derrick Lewis is it will tire him out. Now, Derrick Lewis has got a couple of explosions in him, but ultimately that's how he gets back up to his feet. He waits and waits and waits and then suddenly explodes. That expends energy. And I think Lewis might be able to get back up to his feet once or twice. But the thing is, I think Spivac will stick to the task. He'll stick to the game plan. I think he'll keep taking Derrick Lewis down until Lewis has had enough, until Sergey Spivac can either find himself a finish via ground and pound TKO or find a submission. Like I said, I think outside of Derrick Lewis landing that bomb, it's a very difficult fight for him stylistically, because Spivac's smart, and there's no pride with Spivac in regards to anything to prove with Lewis. I think he's going to get straight into the wrestling, take him down, and I think he's going to rinse and repeat until he ultimately finds that finish. So I'm picking Sergey Spivac to win this fight. And talking of wrestling, in the next fight, we've got Cutelaba versus Kennedy Nzechukwu. And when I say talking of wrestling, that is on the side of Ion Cutelaba. Ion Cutelaba has got that Greco-Roman wrestling background, although we tend to see more of a traditional freestyle wrestling approach from him inside the cage, which is very interesting because, like I say, Greco-Roman's more upper body takedowns, and the freestyle wrestling with Ion Cutelaba's takedowns tends to be more of the single leg, double leg type of takedowns against the cage. And obviously what comes with Ion Cutelaba is aggression and power. But this is where I think that he's going to have a really difficult time against Kennedy Nzechukwu, because Nzechukwu's improving, he's developing. When he came into the UFC, there was a little bit of hype around him, I think predominantly because he was Nigerian, and there was a lot of insane Nigerian fighters in the UFC at that time. Usman, Adesanya, Sadiq Yusuf was in there as well. So the fact that Nzechukwu was coming from Nigeria, I think, did definitely work towards the hype, but I think the hype died down pretty quickly. There was a couple of off fights. He was a little bit inconsistent, but now I feel like he's finding some kind of form. I feel like he's found himself as a fighter. He understands who he is. He's tall, he's long, he's rangy, he's a good striker, and I think that his range management has ultimately got better, which is key because, like I said, he is very tall, he is very long, and I think that's where Cutelaba is going to have problems in this fight because of the physique of Kennedy Nzechukwu. I think because Nzechukwu is tall, he is long, from a wrestling perspective, I think Cutelaba is going to find it hard taking Nzechukwu down, because it is always difficult taking the real long guy down, because they tend to be able to find a foot on the mat, a leg on the mat at some point, or, you know, just be able to get back up to the feet pretty quickly once they are taken down. And then in regards to the power, I think Cutelaba is going to have to get in real close to land something big and hard on Nzechukwu. And although it's a possibility, I just think Nzechukwu, like I said, he's finding himself as a fighter. He's now understanding his strengths to his physique that he has, you know, using that tall, long, rangy frame, getting that distance management, being able to set a pace in a fight as well, and just ultimately be able to land volume. I don't think he's a fighter that is going to find too many knockouts. I don't think he's going to knock Cutelaba out, but what I do think he's going to do is get Cutelaba frustrated, get Cutelaba chasing him, following him around the cage rather than cutting angles, and I think Nzechukwu is just going to be landing volume on the back foot throughout the majority of the fight. Yes, it could get a little bit sketchy if we get to the judges' scorecards and Cutelaba is winging the big bombs, which the judges seem to, you know, have that in a higher priority than anything else right now. So it could get a little bit sketchy from that perspective. But if Cutelaba is consistently missing and Kennedy Nzechukwu is just touching him up, then the judges are going to have no argument in regards to who wins the fight, and that's what I think is going to happen. I think Cutelaba is going to get frustrated. I think he's going to struggle getting any wrestling going. I think he's going to struggle putting too much on Nzechukwu to the point where he's just going to start slowly falling behind on the rounds. For those reasons, I'm picking Kennedy Nzechukwu to win this fight. And in the next fight, this one only got added last week, I believe. We've got Chase Sherman versus Waldo Cortes-Acosta. Now, Chase Sherman's supposed to have fought a couple of weeks ago against Josh Parisian. Parisian pulled out on fight day. And Waldo Cortes-Acosta, again, he's stepping in on, again, super short notice with a real quick turnaround after his win in his UFC debut. And it's actually a really interesting fight because one of Chase Sherman's biggest weapons is his low kicks. Like, he loves his low kicks. They do hit with power, and in between him getting cut by the UFC, I'm not sure which time it was, whether it was the first time he was cut, the second, or even the third, but I think outside of the UFC, he's actually caused a lot of finishes with the low kicks. Now, what we saw from Waldo Cortes-Acosta in his debut against Jared Vanderaa is Vanderaa, who's not really known for his low kicks, just started finding Waldo Cortes-Acosta's lead leg. And he started landing some really damaging strikes, and Waldo Cortes-Acosta was not checking the kicks. He wasn't really doing anything to defend those low kicks, and his leg just kept on getting worse and worse. And to be honest with you, I'm quite surprised that Cortes-Acosta didn't drop in that fight and the leg just didn't become completely disabled, because it was getting absolutely chopped at, and Cortes-Acosta, like I said, was doing absolutely nothing. So seeing what we've seen, there's definitely a path to victory here for Chase Sherman to really get on those low kicks, because I don't think there's been enough time from fight to fight for Cortes-Acosta to really fix those issues and those holes and just becoming very, you know, putting it on an autopilot in regards to doing something to defend the kicks. However, is this a big enough path to victory for Chase Sherman to really take over this fight? Is it a big enough hole in the game of Cortes-Acosta for Sherman to really capitalise on and win the fight because of it? I'm not totally convinced with that. I think that Waldo Cortes-Acosta as a fighter is better than Chase Sherman. I think his hands are good. I think his forward pressure is good. He's got power as well. And he's also got speed. And this is something else. Chase Sherman isn't the biggest heavyweight. So one advantage he normally has over a lot of heavyweights in the division is speed and movement. But Waldo Cortes-Acosta is very much like that as well. So I think there's going to be a big speed advantage for Cortes-Acosta. I think there's going to be a movement advantage. I think there's going to be a power advantage. I also think that Waldo Cortes-Acosta is the more durable fighter as well, which should matter in this fight. So outside of the low kicks for Sherman, if those don't work, I see a very similar fight playing out and going down to what we saw in Cortes-Acosta's debut against Jared Vanessa. So for those reasons, I'm picking Waldo Cortes-Acosta to win this fight. And in the next fight, this should be a fun one actually. We've got Muslim Salikhov versus Andre Fialho. And I think it's a fight that's going to be won and lost on the feet. Muslim Salikhov obviously has got that kickboxing background. The king of kung fu. His spin attacks, his kicks are just insanely fast, insanely accurate. They get thrown out with little wind up on them, which is very good for Salikhov because he's not telegraphing any of his strikes, whereas Andre Fialho is also a decent striker. He'll come forwards, he'll look to land his hands, he's got power in both of his hands, and he'll look to take your chin into row Z. So it's going to be an interesting fight, but because of the striking differences between each fighter is, both fighters are predominantly strikers, but Salikhov is definitely more technical, he's more composed, he's calmer, he's more relaxed, and he'll build himself in, whereas Andre Fialho just likes to come out like a bull, and when it's go time, it's go time. And I actually think that the style of Andre Fialho is going to work against him here, the striking style, because I think the more he rushes at Salikhov, the more holes in Fialho's game, the more openings that Salikhov is likely to find due to Fialho rushing things a little bit and coming in a little bit too hard. Like I said, Salikhov's the more technical striker, and he's definitely the more educated striker as well. So although, again, there's a possibility that Fialho does land something on Salikhov and knock Salikhov out, I just feel that the way Fialho strikes is going to give Salikhov opportunities and moments to really pick his shots, find the home for some of his shots with some clean strikes with both his hands and his kicks as well. And that's another thing. Salikhov's got decent boxing also. He's got power in his hands, and again, I think it's going to be an explosive fight in moments, but I do think that because the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet, because Salikhov's the better educated striker, the striker with a greater fight IQ, and the more technical striker and more experienced striker as well, it's difficult to look past him. So for those reasons, I'm picking Muslim Salikhov to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Cody Brundage versus Rodolfo Vieira. And it's an interesting fight because the background of Brundage is in wrestling, and obviously the background of Rodolfo Vieira, he's one of the most credentialed BJJ players in not just the UFC, but the world of MMA. He was nicknamed the Black Belt Hunter because he was submitting black belts all through, his gradings in BJJ, white belt, purple belt, brown belt, black belt. He's always been submitting black belts. He's very, very credentialed, and he's ultimately a ridiculously dangerous grappler and submission artist. But the one issue that comes with Rodolfo Vieira is that cardio, and the gas tank is absolutely massive for the weight division, and he's gassed out badly in multiple fights. We've seen it time and time again. He'll come out hard and strong in round one, but what's strange is you would think his gas tank from grappling is really good because that's where his background is, but he tires there as well, and it's just a case of the fact that he's so big for the division. There's so much muscle mass. Once the lactic acid starts building up in those muscles, that's when he'll tire. And, it's because of his frame and his size. It's not even a pacing issue. He's just huge and strong for the division. But does Cody Brundage want to wrestle Rodolfo Vieira? Because Brundage, like I say, that's where his background is. The one good thing going for Brundage here is the fact that his striking is developing and is improving. And he's going to need that against Rodolfo Vieira. But what he's also going to need is his wrestling just from a defensive perspective, and these things will help. His striking improvements will help. His defensive wrestling will help. The problem is, do I think that Rodolfo Vieira is not going to get him down? No, I don't. Do I think Vieira is going to have a lot of success with a single leg or a double leg? Maybe not, but I think Vieira is going to be able to force the fight against the cage. I think he's going to be able to use his strength and physicality, and I think he's going to be able to get a trip, hop the back, get a hip toss. There's going to be something that Rodolfo Vieira is going to do, maybe even pulls guard and then sweeps. He's got the ability, the serious BJJ ability to be able to do that comfortably and confidently. So I think the answer to my question is, does Rodolfo Vieira get the fight down to the mat at some point? I think he does. And I think once that fight gets to the mat, I think the gap in skill is going to be too big. I think Cody Brundage is going to struggle to get back up to his feet. And listen, if he does make it out of round one, maybe he does have some success. We have seen Vieira going late in fights since he last gassed out bad. But ultimately, like I say, I think that the fight is going to hit the mat. I think once it hits the mat, the gap in skill is going to be too big. I think Vieira is going to be too good from a grappling perspective. And I think he will get Brundage out of there in that scenario once he's on top with 90 seconds or more to work. So for those reasons, I'm picking Rodolfo Vieira to win this fight. And in the next fight, one of the most hyped fighters right now by the hardcore MMA fan base, we've got Della Maddalena versus Danny Roberts. I actually think this is a really good fight, and I think the UFC, again, they just know, the matchmakers know what they're doing. They're in that job for a reason, and although they're not giving Della Maddalena any sort of layup here, absolutely not. Danny Roberts is a dangerous fighter and a good striker, but it's for those reasons why they've given Della Maddalena that fight with Danny Roberts, because not only is Danny Roberts going to have moments, Danny Roberts is dangerous. I think he's going to be competitive, and what it's going to do is just give Della Maddalena the right experience. It's the right step up in competition for Maddalena in this fight in order to be able to have a competitive fight against another dangerous fighter and also look good by doing so. Obviously, I'm giving away my prediction and picking this breakdown in the early moments. And although I do think genuinely that Maddalena is going to be tested with the striking skill set of Danny Roberts has also got decent wrestling and he's got a decent grappling game, but I just don't think it's going to flourish in this fight. I definitely think it's a fight that's going to be won and lost due to the striking and what happens on the feet. I just think that Maddalena is going to be the quicker striker, the more efficient striker. I think he's going to put combinations together a little bit better. Like I said, I think Danny Roberts is going to be competitive throughout this fight for as long as it goes on, whether that be, a first round finish, a second round finish, a third round finish, or if the fight goes to a decision. I think Roberts, up until the fight is over, is going to be extremely competitive and be challenging for Maddalena. But like I said, I think Maddalena's got a striking efficiency advantage. I think he's got an accuracy advantage, a speed advantage, a movement advantage. And ultimately, I think the longer the fight does go on, the better Maddalena's going to look throughout the fight. I think the more Danny Roberts is going to start absorbing strikes. And I think it's a really good fight, like I've already said, for Maddalena to come out here, be tested in a fight that is going to be competitive, but also by looking great doing so. I think Danny Roberts is going to bring the best out of Maddalena in this fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Della Maddalena to win this fight. And in the next fight, I think this is going to be a fun fight. We've got Zhalgas Zhumagulov versus Charles Johnson. And this is definitely a more winnable fight for Charles Johnson than his UFC debut in London against Muhammad Mokaev. And I think that Charles Johnson's actually a good fighter. When you go and watch tape on him, he's a very in-your-face striker. He doesn't back down from any exchanges, but he's quick, he's got good movement, and he's really big for the division as well. He's also got decent wrestling, he's got a good grappling game as well. He's just a very well-rounded fighter, and it's very typical of a former LFA champion. Now, LFA is very much like the UK equivalent of Cage Warriors. When you become a champion in Cage Warriors or in LFA, it means you have been battle tested, because the matchmaking is brilliant in those promotions outside of, the big UFC promotion, and to the point where any champion has been tested along the way. They are battle tested. They'll have been tested in multiple style differences as well, striking, wrestling, grappling, and the UFC ready. And that's exactly what we have with Charles Johnson. It's just with his UFC debut, he just couldn't beat Muhammad Mokaev, who was a potential future champion in the division. So nothing bad from Charles Johnson's perspective in that UFC debut. Now, from Zhalgas Zhumagulov's side, I think he's a good striker as well. And again, I think he's underrated. The one problem that I do have with Zhalgas Zhumagulov is Zhumagulov tends to fight to the level of his opponent. So if he's fighting an opponent that is not as great as him, he will perform a little bit lesser than what he should. And if he's fighting an opponent that's much better than him, again, he'll step his game up and perform where he should. And for some fighters, this is actually a great trait to have, because it allows fights to be close even when, they should lose the fight, if that makes sense. It's allowing a fight to be close. But the thing is with Zhumagulov is he tends to lose a lot of these fights in the UFC because they are that close. And with the way that the judges are judging the fights, looking at fighters looking to be really aggressive and take their opponent's heads off, Zhumagulov's just not that type of fighter. He is more of a calm and patient point scoring type of fighter that will be, subtly efficient, if that makes sense. So he was not really going to wow anybody, but he'll be doing just enough to keep a fight close. But the thing is, when these fights are going to a decision, Zhumagulov's more often than not at the other end of the decision and the other end of the win, because he's just not doing enough in the judges' eyes. Where I think this fight's going to be another one of those close fights, but I think Charles Johnson's going to be landing the harder shots, the visibly harder shots. I think he's going to be more aggressive. I think he's going to be leading the dance more often than not, and all these things are going to work in his favour. So even in a close fight, like, I could see, for example, if this fight went to a decision, I could see all 3 rounds being close, but the judges just edging every round to Charles Johnson, because he's just doing that little bit more inside the cage, looking that little bit more aggressive, landing those little bit harder shots than what Zhumagulov's landing. And that's going to make him more efficient in this fight. I think Zhumagulov's going to keep this fight close. I think he's going to keep it competitive. But ultimately, I think Charles Johnson's just going to start edging the rounds and edging in every single discipline within mixed martial arts, whether that be the striking, the wrestling and the grappling. And I think he's going to do just enough here to take the win. And I'm picking Charles Johnson to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got an interesting fight here between Jennifer Maia and Maryna Moroz. Now, Maryna Moroz has been on a tear lately. Again, she's one of those fighters where I think that most people thought she was just going to be a fringe fighter and she'll get some wins, but she'll get some losses. But she's actually now on a 3-fight win streak. Now, those opponents aren't necessarily the best opponents that she's fought, but she's on a 3-fight win streak, nonetheless. And then you look at Jennifer Maia's side. Jennifer Maia's now on a 2-fight losing streak. Bear in mind that Maia's been at the top of this division for many, many years now, and a former Invicta champion as well. The one thing that I will say about Maia, though, is she does only lose against the best of the best. So she's on a 2-fight losing streak, losing to Manon Fiorot and Caitlin Chookagian. But, she's also lost again against Caitlin Chookagian, twice in total, Valentina Shevchenko as well. So these are all fighters at the top of the division that she's losing to that would also beat Maryna Moroz. So I don't think you can penalise Jennifer Maia too much for those losses. Now, from Moroz's perspective, like I said, she's a fighter that's been, improving and developing very subtly, very slowly, and, doing well in her fights. The problem I think she's going to have in this fight with Jennifer Maia is Maryna Moroz has been leaning very much on her wrestling and grappling. I think she's one of those types of fighters that she was a striker predominantly, but then she's brought her wrestling and grappling on so much to the point where she's now using the wrestling and grappling probably too much in fights where she's probably just got the striking advantage, but she's fell in love with that wrestling and grappling. And I think whichever way you look at this fight, it's going to be difficult, because Moroz is going to be at a physical disadvantage, in my opinion. I think that Jennifer Maia is going to be the bigger, the thicker, stronger fighter. And the reason that I think that matters here is because Maryna Moroz, although she's having success with her wrestling, her takedown completion rate is still really low. And I don't think she's a flourishing wrestler. So can she take Maia down? I think she absolutely could. But with the wrestling, I don't think that Maryna Moroz is going to hit a clear takedown. So that means that she's probably going to have to secure a hip toss or a trip or, some form of drag down to get Maia down to the mat in a clinch scenario. And I think that Maia, like I said, the physicality will help her. But I'm not ruling out a Maryna Moroz takedown. If she does take Maia down, though, I think Maia, being a BJJ black belt, I think she's going to be the better grappler. I think she's going to be able to stand back up to her feet. It's not very often a fighter takes her down and keeps her down. So I'm just looking at where Maryna Moroz wins this fight, and I think her path to victory is definitely just landing more volume on her opponents, and in this case, Jennifer Maia. And I think trying to land more volume on Maia, she might get there. But the thing is, Maia's a decent striker, boxing heavy striker. She's got good counters. She's good fighting, moving backwards as well as forwards. So I do think that overall, Maryna Moroz is going to do enough in this fight to keep it close, to keep it competitive, and we might even get to a decision where we're thinking, okay, well, Maia might have taken round 1 or Moroz might have taken round 3, or however those rounds work, but then there's one round which we're just really not sure of. It could cause a split decision. I don't think it's going to be a whitewash from Maia. What I'm saying is, the way that Moroz fights, I think Maia's going to have an answer for Moroz. an answer that Moroz's last 3 opponents just didn't have. And I think this is just a big step up in competition for Moroz. And again, it's not a step up in competition she can't handle, but one that's just going to be more competitive than her last 3 fights. I do think it's going to be a close and competitive fight. I don't think either fighter's going to completely run away with this fight, but I am going to be siding with the fighter that only loses to the best fighters in the world. So I'm picking Jennifer Maia to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Miles Johns versus Vince Morales. Now, Miles Johns was a fighter that I absolutely loved coming into the UFC. He's that typical wrestler, boxer type of fighter, you know, the wrestling background, but very good with his hands, very tight in his defense, and does have that sneaky knockout power as well. But it just hasn't really worked out for Miles Johns too much. Like, I know he's got a couple of knockouts in the UFC, which is great, but he's not really taking fights by the scruff of the neck, if that makes sense. He can make fights a lot closer than what they need to be. He can be in fights where he's not really fighting to his strength. So when you're thinking, shoot, Miles, shoot, you know, use your wrestling advantage against your opponent. Again, it's just not quite worked out for him. And I've not given up on Miles Johns, you know, as a fighter that can make some waves in the division, but I definitely think that, you know, I'm sort of more on the fence than what I was before. Now, against Vince Morales is a good all-round fighter. He does have, a lot of wrestling experience, so he doesn't really use it in the cage from an offensive perspective. He's just relatively difficult to take down. The one thing he is susceptible to is low kicks from a striking perspective, but again, his striking's good, and he's got a good boxing heavy game as well, also mixes and kicks. He's got a varied striking arsenal, and it's just one of those fights that I think is just going to be super close, because typically in a fight like this, I'd be picking someone like Miles Johns to win, who's got the wrestling, who's got the boxing, who's got that sneaky power that in both hands that could land something to knock you out. But Vince Morales is durable, he's tough. I think from a striking perspective, he's just going to be more efficient than Miles Johns. Maybe Miles Johns is winging the big punches to knock him out, but Vince Morales is just putting nice sharp combinations together. From a wrestling perspective, Johns could take Morales down, but Morales will make him work for that takedown, or make him work for those takedowns. But then if Johns is taking him down, is Johns' topside grappling enough to keep Morales down? I'm not convinced with that either. So I just feel that whichever way this fight goes, it's going to be super competitive, it's going to be back and forth, and it's going to be a fight that for as long as it goes on, both fighters are going to be absolutely in this fight until the final moments of if there is a finish or if the fight goes to a decision. In these types of fights, I tend to side with, more often than not, the underdog, so I'm picking Vince Morales to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got Ricky Turcios versus Kevin Natividad. And Kevin Natividad, I think, a lot like Miles Johns, Natividad came into the UFC with a lot of promise, a dangerous fighter, a bit of hype around him as well. Not too much hype, but I think that Natividad just hasn't played out for Natividad in the UFC to this point, to what I believe he probably would have wanted it to. And against Ricky Turcios, I think he's got a difficult fight here, because Turcios has got a real high pressure game. His striking is not overly clean or crisp or sharp at all, but the good news for Turcios, and I say this a lot, the judges don't score technique, the judges score strikes landed, and no matter how those strikes are thrown out, no matter in what way they're thrown out, if they're landing, the judges are going to like that and see it, but they're also going to like the pace and the pressure that Turcios puts on his opponents also. Now, Turcios has got to be really careful actually coming in, that he's not too reckless, because for as good as an offensive or efficient striker is what he is, defensively he's a bit hands down, he can get hit a little bit too much. Kevin Natividad does have power, he has got those explosions, so if Turcios is coming in recklessly, it's going to give Natividad options and opportunities to maybe land something on Turcios and change the course of the fight. But the thing is, when you start to look at the wrestling and grappling, I think the wrestling may be on the side of Natividad, but again, once the fight hits the mat, I think Turcios is just a real handful and a real nightmare to deal with. That's where he's predominantly best as well. So I think what I'm trying to say here is Turcios has got some advantages on the feet. He's got some advantages on the mat. That's multiple paths to victory. I think for Kevin Natividad to win this fight, first and foremost, he's got to match the pace and pressure of Turcios before he can even get his own game going. And that's where I think it's going to be really difficult for Natividad just to get a hold of this fight and start taking over. I think there's multiple paths to victory for Ricky Turcios, and for that reason, I am picking Ricky Turcios to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Maria Oliveira versus Vanessa Demopoulos. without being too disrespectful, I feel like both of these women have been really underwhelming in the UFC. Although I will say that last time out, Maria Oliveira looked much better than what she has done in the UFC and pre-UFC as well. Pre-UFC, I'm really surprised that Oliveira got signed to the UFC, but to her credit, she is developing a little bit. Whereas Vanessa Demopoulos, I think she's done her best work already. I think that she's a fighter that, she's one of those fighters that is decent everywhere, you know, jack of all trades but a master of none, I think is the right phrase to use, where she's okay wherever the fight goes. You know, she's got abilities both offensively and defensively, but I just don't think she's a fighter that, again, is going to really get a hold of too many fights in the UFC and stamp her authority in those fights and allow her to thrive in any specific aspect, because she's not a specialist. She's not that beast striker, or she's not that beast wrestler, or that BJJ ace. And I think Maria Oliveira, with the development that she's shown last time, has probably given me enough to watch in order to side very slightly with her in this fight. But, you know, if this fight does go south for Oliveira and Vanessa Demopoulos does have moments, big moments, or just moments where she can just control Oliveira, I think Demopoulos would do better trying to take Oliveira down, putting Oliveira on her back. I think that's where Oliveira can get a little bit stuck. So if we see that game plan from Demopoulos and she ends up, you know, controlling large portions of the fight and winning, I won't be surprised. But like I said, I'm going with the fighter who I believe is still developing, that looked much sharper last time out than she's looked before, which shows clear improvements in a game. For those reasons, I am siding very slightly with Maria Oliveira to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got Fernie Garcia versus Brady Hiestand. I think this is actually a really well-matched fight, and I think it could be a fun fight. Fernie Garcia came in from the Dana White Contender Series, you know, a lot of hype after that win on the Contender Series. Boxing heavy striker, family of boxers, you know, sharp striking, quick movement, all that good stuff. But he did get found out in his UFC debut. Now, against Brady Hiestand is a fighter that is your very typical mixed martial artist. You know, he's not, like I've already mentioned with Vanessa Demopoulos in the last breakdown, he's not an absolute specialist in any one area, but he is good everywhere. However, he does have a decent grappling game, and I think that's where he's predominantly best. If he can get fights down to the mat, he does show a good level of control. Now, this fight's interesting because Fernie Garcia is more than likely going to want to keep this fight on the feet. I think Brady Hiestand is going to want to take this fight down to the mat. He's also got not bad wrestling either. So it's a case of who wins. Does Fernie Garcia keep this fight upright and outland Brady Hiestand, potentially knock him out? Or does Brady Hiestand get his wrestling game going, get some good positions on the mat and control large periods? I think that Hiestand is going to be the smarter fighter here in regards to, well, maybe not the smarter fighter here, but I think he's going to fight a smart fight. I think he's going to be very aware of the striking. He might test his striking out for 30-60 seconds to see how he feels with the speed and the movement. But ultimately, I think Hiestand is going to be shooting the takedowns. I think he is going to be wanting to get the fight down to the mat, and I think he's going to have success doing it. Once the fight gets down to the mat, I think Hiestand could potentially either just control positions and run the clock down, winning rounds along the way, or I think he could potentially find a submission. He's got a decent submission game as well. So I think that the wrestling and the grappling is going to play out in a big way for Brady Hiestand in this fight. I think on the feet, Fernie Garcia is definitely going to have the advantages, but when all is said and done, I think Fernie Garcia's striking game could potentially even get shut down by him being hesitant, knowing that Hiestand wants to fight down to the mat and that he can get it down to the mat and control him on the mat as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Brady Hiestand to win this fight. And in the final breakdown of the podcast, the final fight, we get to Natalia Silva versus the newcomer Teresa Bleda. Now, Bleda is a real interesting fighter. I think she's a fighter that deserves a spot in the UFC. I think that she's got good wrestling. I think her grappling's really good as well. Her striking is still a little bit of a work in progress, but she has been training with fighters like Manon Fialho, so you can only imagine that that striking is going to be improved the longer that she trains and is developing at this high level of her career. Now, Natalia Silva on the other end is going to make this a really fascinating fight, because Natalia Silva looked completely different to what we saw outside of the UFC. When she came into her UFC debut, she was a much more fluid striker. She was efficient and movement was good. Outside of the UFC, she looked more of a wrestler and grappler type of fighter. But like I said, her striking's come on leaps and bounds, and she looked phenomenal in that UFC debut. And honestly, I actually think this is going to be a really fun fight. Now, Teresa Bleda, Like I said, she's got really good wrestling. She's sharp with her entries. She'll shoot reactionary double leg takedowns, and even outside of her pro career, she had an amateur exhibition fight with Lucy Pudilova just a couple of years ago with it was MMA just with some modified rules, but she was very much just taking Pudilova down constantly. Really good takedown. She did tire out, but listen, when you're wrestling that much for that long, it is going to be tiring. And she beat Lucy Pudilova in that fight. So I think that Blader has had the right type of opponents, good quality opponents, to make her relevant in the UFC. I don't think she's had a fast track, and I think this fight is going to be extremely competitive. I think Silva's, if she comes into this fight, and that last fight wasn't a one-off performance, and that she does have that seriously good striking, I think that she's probably going to be the better striker than Blader here. But I think that Blader's going to look to her wrestling, her topside grappling, where she is just very, very good. And I think she's going to cause a lot of problems in the UFC moving forward. But with the fight that she's got in front of her against Natalia Silva, I do think it's going to be close. I do think it's going to be competitive. I do think both women are going to have the moments. But I just like the game of Blader. I like the takedowns. I like the grappling. She's controlled and she's just efficient on the mat. And I think with Silva, she can get a little bit stuck on the mat. We haven't seen too much of it, but there was a few moments outside of the UFC where she can get a little bit stuck on her back. And I think if that's Blader on top of her, Blader will be able to have some success. It's a difficult fight to really be absolutely confident on. I do think it's going to be competitive, but I am siding with the newcomer. I'm picking Teresa Blader to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast. As always, thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys for liking the videos, to subscribing to the MMA Play 365 YouTube channel, which, again, we are trying to hit 1,000 subscribers. So if you are listening to this on YouTube, or even if you're not listening to this on YouTube, come over to YouTube, subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. If I've ever helped you with any analysis, with any predictions or cash-in betting tickets, then please do me a favor and just show some support by subscribing to the channel. And if you are betting this weekend, you've got some bets, if you disagree with some of my predictions, again, drop anything in the comments, and it is me that replies to the comments, so I'll always try and make sure that I put some time aside to get back to you guys. We are also on all the other big podcasting platforms now: Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and there's another big one that I forgot, but yeah, we're on all the podcasts, so anywhere that you find your podcast, we'll be there now. And that's all from me this week, so thank you for listening. I'm Newsome, and I'll see you again next week.